Hello, these are Flip Notes 3.5 Part 5 in our learning unit. In this section, we're extending on operant conditioning and classical conditioning with schedules of reinforcement. My Bitmoji is asking the question when and how many, which are both things that tie into rewards and punishments. When can a reward occur? And after how many times do you need to do something before you can receive a reward or a punishment? Let's get into it.
A quick review of some things we talked about in the last one. Reinforcement and punishment. Remember that reinforcement is increasing our behavior, and punishment is always with the intention of decreasing a behavior. And we can do that through either primary or secondary reinforcers. Those can also serve as primary or secondary punishers by withholding food or by giving bad grades. So they can serve with rewards and punishment. And then we spent quite a bit of time in the last video talking about this. And I just wanted to remind you that when we say positive and negative, we're talking about adding and taking away. So positive punishment is not a good thing. Positive punishment means we are adding something that'll decrease a behavior, like adding community service hours to a prisoner so that he will stop doing whatever he was doing. So now we have to ask the question of when are we going to do this reinforcement or punishment? I'm just really going to say reinforcement, but it applies to both. On a continuous schedule of reinforcement, you're going to give the reward or the punishment every single time that they do the response. So this is going to cause them to learn the behavior very quickly. But as soon as you stop giving that reward or giving that punishment, the behavior is also going to stop too. So it's subject to rapid extinction. So for example, maybe if I'm an elementary teacher and I want my students to raise their hand, every time a student raises their hand, I give them M&Ms. The kids will pick up very quickly. I raise my hand, I get M&Ms. Raise my hand, get M&Ms. So they'll learn it very quickly. The other type of schedule is a partial schedule. This means that we're going to reinforce the behavior sometimes, but not all the time. And this is actually more resistant to extinction because you don't know when exactly the reward is going to come. Maybe if I raise my hand this time, the teacher will give me an M&M, or maybe I have to raise my hand. You know, she didn't pick up somebody last time, but maybe the next time they will. So they're going to keep raising their hand. In general, partially reinforced behaviors last much longer because there's always that hope that the behavior is going to be reinforced. Whereas with the continuous one, you know you get it every time. Eventually, you may tire of it and say, I don't want to do it. Or again, you know that as soon as it stops, it's done. So partial reinforcement schedules can be broken down into two more categories, fixed and variable. And we're actually really four, ratio and interval, and fixed and variable. So on ratio schedules, the reinforcement is based on the number of responses. So for example, with a fixed ratio, you're going to reward every blank response. So for example, if a car salesman gets a bonus for every 5 cars he sells, that's a fixed ratio. He sells 5 cars, bonus. 5 more cars, bonus. So we get rewarded the same. In sports, most points are based on a fixed ratio. You score a touchdown in football, you get 6 points. Next touchdown, 6 points. In basketball, you shoot a free throw, you always get 3 points. It's a fixed ratio. In a variable ratio, the ratio or the amount in order to get the reinforcement varies. It's unpredictable. So perhaps in order to get your bonus, 1 month you need 5 cars because maybe it's the summertime and you sell a lot of cars. But in another month, you need even more cars, 7 cars. But perhaps in January it's kind of slow, so you only need 2 cars. So the amount you have to sell in order to get the bonus varies each month. You never know how many you're going to have to sell. The classic example of a variable ratio reinforcement schedule is a slot machine. So in places like Las Vegas, they've got tons of these if you go on a cruise ship. And people just keep putting money in them and pulling that lever. These numbers spin, and if you match 3, then you win. And people keep playing and playing and playing because you never know how many times you have to pull that lever before you'll win. You could pull it once and you could win the big jackpot. or maybe you got to pull it 100 times and then you'll win. But there's always that thought, maybe if I just pull it one more time, that could be the time that I win. But it varies. So again, the variable ratio in this one is going to last even longer because you don't know when the reinforcement comes, so you keep working for it. Our other partial reinforcement schedule are interval schedules, and these are based on the amount of time. When will the response happen? In a fixed interval, it's always the same amount of time in between responses. So let's say that a car salesman gets a standard paycheck every 2 weeks, or anybody. If you always get paid every 2 weeks, that's a fixed interval. There's always 2 weeks, the amount of time in between when you get paid. If we get a quiz every single Friday, that would be a fixed interval. It's always the same number of days in between the quizzes. In a variable interval, the interval varies unpredictably. We don't know when the reinforcement will come. So let's say you get a bonus whenever the boss comes by, but you don't know when the boss is going to drop by. Maybe he'll drop by once a month. Maybe he drops by every other week, but you don't know when that will happen. Pop quizzes are a classic example of variable interval. Sometimes you have a quiz on Friday, sometimes it's on Tuesday. You don't know. Now, variable schedules also, interval schedules also have stronger behaviors because if you know the quiz is every Friday, probably going to study Thursdays, maybe Friday morning, but you know exactly when it's going to happen. So you prepare for it then. And there's a lot of other times that you're not preparing. If you think that you're going to have pop quizzes, you always have to be prepared because you never know when the response will happen. A few more examples of reinforcement schedules, looking at this is kind of what Skinner actually studied with his rats in his operant chambers. On the fixed ratio schedule, the rat would press the lever 5 times. He would get a reward. Press the lever 5 more times, got a reward. So he had a fixed number of times he had to press the lever. With a variable ratio, the rat would vary. Sometimes he pushed the lever 5 times, he'd get a reward. Sometimes you push it 2, you get a reward. 6, 8, it was random. And that rat would not tire of pressing the lever as quickly as would when doing the fixed ratio because, again, he didn't know when the reward would come. He didn't know if it was going to take him 1 more time or 5 more times. So he would keep pressing that lever. In the fixed interval, the rat could press the lever and the food comes out 30 seconds later. Variable, and then he presses the lever, 30 seconds later. Like he knows how long he has to wait. In variable interval, maybe the food would come out immediately sometimes. Then he'd press the lever again, and the next time maybe it would come out a minute later. Then the next time, 30 seconds later. So it varies when the reward will come. Again, as far as it goes with resistance to extinction, the variable behaviors last longer. They're more resistant to extinction, even if it's a ratio or an interval. Whereas the fixed behaviors, they disappear sooner. There are side effects of using punishments, and we don't get into this a whole lot, but research has shown that using punishment, like how he was shocking the animals, can cause them to be more aggressive, become more passive aggressive. Instead, people and animals just learn to avoid things, so avoidance behavior. Then they model that, and then they teach others to be aggressive. Maybe things will be better, but they just temporarily suppress the behavior and then learned helplessness. So looking back a little and comparing these two now, classical conditioning, both have multiple names. Classical nobody ever really calls it respondent, but sometimes Pavlovian, but really we just say classical. Operant conditioning, usually we just say operant conditioning. Sometimes they reference the law of effect, which were very similar, but Skinner kind of got all the credit. We want to make sure we remember these names, Pavlov and Watson for conditioning, or classical conditioning, Thorndike and Skinner for operant. The example here, the sound of the bell in classical conditioning produces salivation. In operant conditioning, a baby cries, and then his reward is the parents pick up the baby. Key terms, all those ones with unconditioned, conditioned stimulus, unconditioned, conditioned response. In operant conditioning, our keywords are reinforcement, punishment, both positive and negative, shaping, and then those continuous and partial reinforcement schedules. Both of them talk about the idea of extinction, spontaneous recovery, generalization, and discrimination, that you can apply those to both. Classical conditioning is involuntary, operant conditioning is voluntary. And then there's the order. The conditioned stimulus has to come first in classical conditioning, and the reinforcement comes after in operant conditioning. Applying the operant conditioning, you have to provide immediate and clear feedback. If the reward or the punishment comes much later, then it's hard for animals or people to form that association. If you've ever you've written an essay and then it took the teacher 2 months to grade it, by the time you get it back, it doesn't really have an effect on you. You've already moved on. If it's a bad grade, I'm like, well, I'm already done with that. It doesn't have a strong effect. So the response needs to be right away. You want to put the reinforcer and the punisher as close to the response as possible. They need to be consistent, and then there should be feedback. Biofeedback is a specific type of operant conditioning where you can learn to control some of your physiological processes using specific types of machines to control them. This can work without machines as well, but let me explain the example a little bit more. So let's say you are trying to learn to control your heart rate because of anxiety. What this machine can do is you can hook it up to you and you'll measure your pulse. Or even what he's doing here is trying to measure movement in his forehead. And then when you see that your heart rate is up, you can consciously try to calm it down through deep breathing, conscious relaxation, and you're getting feedback. So you see this and then you do the behavior, like you take deep breaths, and then you can see the response right away. You get this biological feedback of what that does to your heart rate and to your nerves. We're going to go into a better example in class, but biofeedback is using machinery to try to control physiological conditions with operant conditioning.